From ABC 7 News, this is a breaking news alert.
Well, we begin this new with breaking news connected to last week's raid at the Prince George's County Liquor Board. We are now learning the name of one state lawmaker being connected to this bribery ring. Our Maryland Bureau Chief Brad Bell has been covering this story since it started last Thursday. He's in the newsroom now with those breaking details for us. Brad?
Yeah, Jimmy, as we have been reporting, we've been waiting for the so-called other shoe to drop, for more charges to be announced, and now it has happened. Former state delegate, former Prince George's County Council member Will Campos has pleaded guilty to conspiracy and to bribery. I've just had an opportunity to read through some of the FBI affidavit in this case, and they are talking about Campos accepting bribes back in 2012. They're saying that he was essentially selling taxpayers' money in exchange for bribes. This has to do with a $100,000 fund that Prince George's County Council members were given to dole out to charities in their districts. And it is alleged that Campos was giving that money away in exchange for bribes. All of this surfacing, of course, in connection with this wide-ranging scandal having to do with what you're seeing on the screen now, the raids last week of a couple of liquor stores and other businesses that involved bribery and the Prince George's County Liquor Board. The FBI saying at the time that they operate like a submarine just below the surface and that they only emerge when they need to. And what we have seen now is that the FBI has been listening to the conversations of politicians, including Campos and others, for a very long time. And these charges are, in fact, now surfacing. It is alleged that Campos took more than $21,000 in bribes, dating back, as we said, to 2012. He was elected to the Prince George's County Council in 2004, to the House of Delegates in 2014, and he resigned a very short time later in September of 2015. Again, this is a fast-breaking story. We expect a press conference from the U.S. Attorney this afternoon at 2:30, and we will be there, and we'll bring you the very latest. In the newsroom, Brad Bell, ABC 7 News.
All right, Brad, thank you.
I want to take you right now, though, to Prince George's County, where we are standing by to hear from the Maryland U.S. Attorney, the Justice Department, the FBI, and it is possible other local police agencies are getting ready to hold a news conference. We're waiting for the principals to come through that door right now. And when we do, we will hear more about what has become a fairly serious corruption scandal that has netted so far 2 elected officials and could net others. We'll take you there just as soon as it starts. But in the meantime, tonight, they have assembled now on Capitol, or not on Capitol Hill, in Prince George's, and we want to take you there to this news conference. Let's listen in.
Partners have been working with us in combating corruption here in Prince George's County and throughout the state of Maryland. We have Special Agent in Charge Gordon Johnson of the FBI, joined by Assistant Special Agent in Charge Scott Hinckley and Public Corruption Supervisor Wendy Hassett. From the Prince George's County Police Department, Chief Hank Stawinski is here with us, who's been a strong partner in combating corruption as well as violent crime and other types of crime here in the county. In addition, representing the IRS is Assistant Special Agent in Charge Kareem Carter. Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Wyndham, who's leading the federal investigation, is here with us, as well as some of the other agents and prosecutors who've been working on the case. Last week, we announced the arrests of 4 defendants in connection with a wide-ranging bribery scheme that was exposed through an undercover investigation led by the FBI. That corruption related primarily to the Prince George's County Liquor Board. We arrested Liquor Board members David Sun and Anuj Sood, and 2 liquor store owners who allegedly paid bribes. Those men were Young Peg and Shin Lee. Today, we are unsealing a plea agreement that was entered last Thursday in a related case. Now, the case today is not about the Liquor Board, and I'm not going to be able to speak about exactly how this case relates to the case we announced last week. My comments will be limited to the facts in the plea agreement that was unsealed today. Our investigation is ongoing, and for a variety of reasons, I'm not going to be able to put a frame around it for you. I appreciate that many of you will have questions about how these cases relate, and I apologize in advance we may be unable to answer those. Each case stands on its own. The case today involves a plea agreement that was filed in federal court here in Greenbelt last Thursday morning. It was filed under seal, and the plea was entered under seal because of the potential impact on ongoing investigations. The plea agreement was unsealed today because we made a determination it was no longer necessary, there was no longer a compelling need to keep that matter under seal. Our goal is to make public any information that we can as soon as we're able to do so without adversely impacting any ongoing investigation. The defendant in this case is William Campos. Mr. Campos was a county councilman from 2004 to 2014 here in Prince George's County for District 2. In 2014, Mr. Campos was elected to the Maryland legislature. He became a delegate to the Maryland General Assembly, and he served as a legislator from the time he was sworn in January of 2015 until he resigned in September of 2015. Mr. Campos admitted that he accepted payments from several people between 2007 and 2014, including bribes in return for arranging grant money from the Prince George's County Council. The undercover payments that we made in this case were not isolated instances of corruption. They were part and parcel of a long-standing bribery scheme that reflected corruption on the part of Mr. Campos and of a number of people who were willing to pay him in return for government benefits. Now, there are three categories of corruption in which Mr. Campos admitted that he participated. The first category began before our undercover investigation. Beginning in 2011 and continuing until 2014, Mr. Campos took payments from businessmen in return for county council grants. It is admitted in the plea agreement that he took about $9,000 from one business person for a grant of $250,000 in county council funds, and a second payment of approximately $15,000 from another person in return for a grant of $75,000 in county council funds. The second category of corruption occurred during our undercover investigation, and that involved a slush fund that Mr. Campos personally supervised in his capacity as a county councilman in Prince George's County. Prince George's County allows each county council member to have full discretion over how up to $100,000 in funding is distributed to charitable organizations. And Mr. Campos, it was at the discretion of the county council member as to where that money would be spent. And Mr. Campos's favorite charity was himself. And in fact, the evidence that was developed in this investigation, and Mr. Campos admitted in the course of the plea agreement, was that he arranged to accept bribes in return for directing county council funds, taxpayer money, to supposed nonprofit organizations. And the reason why he approved particular nonprofit organizations was that those organizations agreed, or their representatives agreed, to pay kickbacks to Mr. Campos as bribes in return for the charitable funding. The charging documents detail 4 occasions during the undercover investigation in which cash payments were made to Mr. Campos in return for his arranging for charitable grants to go to nonprofits that were specified by the cooperating witness and undercover agent who are working with the FBI. The third category of corruption detailed in the charging document involves an official letter of recommendation. Mr. Campos admitted that in 2014 he accepted a bribe in return for providing a letter on official county letterhead recommending a particular business in return for a bribe of $2,000. The evidence in this case shows that William Campos treated the taxpayers' money as if it were a literal slush fund. His recorded comments reveal that he was cavalier about taxpayer money. He even told people to set up fake nonprofit organizations so that he could direct money to those nonprofit organizations in return for kickbacks from people who would work with him. Mr. Campos was confident that nobody would audit how the money was spent. And I think that's one of the critical lessons that we see in this investigation, is the danger that arises when government officials are permitted to exercise discretion in awarding money, contracts, or other government benefits without any oversight as to how that process is done and as to how the recipient is selected. Mr. Campos pleaded guilty to 2 federal crimes, conspiracy and bribery. Conspiracy carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. Bribery carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. Now, the federal sentencing guidelines are no longer binding on judges, but they are relevant to sentencing. The judge will determine the guidelines and consider those along with all other evidence, including the defendant's acceptance of responsibility and any cooperation that he or she may provide. In this case, the sentencing guidelines call for a sentence on the order of 7 years. That's not necessarily what the defendant will get, but that is an indication of how seriously corruption is treated in the federal criminal justice system. The key to eliminating corruption is to identify areas where officials exercise discretion and where insufficient oversight is provided. In the event that appropriate auditing and oversight is done, there's far less opportunity for schemes like this to develop. And when there isn't any oversight and auditing, there are opportunities for people, if they're so inclined, to take advantage of that and engage in fraudulent schemes. The charging document actually includes quotations from some of the comments that were made by Mr. Campos during the investigation, which give you a very real sense of how he viewed the discretion that was entrusted to him by the taxpayers of Prince George's County. I think there's one point that's very important for me to add, and that is that honest politicians have nothing to fear. We do not engage in fishing expeditions. We initiate federal criminal investigations only when there is credible evidence of corruption. My advice to anybody who has paid or received a bribe here in Prince George's County in the last 5 years, if you have paid or received a bribe in the past 5 years, my advice to you is don't wait for us to contact you. Reach out and call the FBI. They'll be happy to take your call. Anybody who comes forward to us before we come knocking on their door is going to be treated much more favorably than if you wait until we come calling. So if you know of a bribe attempt, if you've been the target of a bribe attempt, if you've been solicited by a government official seeking a bribe in return for government business, we want to tell you that we have a unified commitment of federal, state, and local law enforcement that we will not tolerate that sort of thing here in Prince George's County or anywhere in the state of Maryland. So the FBI's phone number is 410-265-8080. And we want people to know we're open for business, and we're going to make sure that we do everything we can to prevent schemes like this from developing in the future. We're going to have brief comments from the FBI supervisor, the police chief, and the IRS assistant special agent in charge, and then we'll be happy to take any questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Gordon Johnson, and I'm the special agent in charge of the FBI's Baltimore field office. I would like to begin by thanking the men and women of the FBI who conducted this 4-year investigation and through whose work we were able to get to this point. I would also like to thank the United States Attorney's Office, the IRS, and most importantly, the Prince George's County Police Department, and especially Chief Hank Stawinski. Through partnership and collaboration with our state and local partners, we were able to identify and to deal with this public corruption threat. Public corruption is a unique threat. It involves and it has impact on all aspects of our society. And through collaboration and partnership, today we are a much better and safer community. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My message to the community is simple. There are no lengths that I and the men and women of the Prince George's County Police Department will not go to ensure the integrity of our institutions and preserve the public trust. This is absolutely not tolerated, and you need to know that I, as the police chief, have the full support of our county executive, Rashern Baker. One point of clarification in this: the funds are associated with the county council. None of those funds are associated with the economic development fund that Mr. Baker put in place at the beginning of his administration. That's one question that's come to me, and I want to be proactive on that issue with you. So again, this will not be tolerated. As Mr. Rosenstein said, it's important that if you have been solicited or you've been participating in this activity, you step forward, contact the agencies that you see before you, and mitigate the downside in terms of consequences, because we are actively investigating these issues. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Kareem Carterwood, Assistant Special Agent in charge of IRS Criminal Investigation. Today's plea should send a strong message to those who believe law does not apply to them. IRS Criminal Investigation is committed to ensuring that unethical public officials are not able to profit at the expense of other Americans who play by the rules. The prosecution of individuals such as Mr. Campos who engage in unethical business practices in an effort to enrich themselves will continue to remain a priority of law enforcement and IRS and criminal investigation. I'd like to conclude by thanking all of the individuals involved for their hard work in unraveling this scheme. Thank you.
I'd be happy to take any questions.
Rod,
Yes, sir.
Each one of these documents you revealed talks about even more people. How widespread is this criminality in Prince George's County and state government?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm not going to be able to talk beyond what you see in these charging documents. Obviously, we have a number of folks who were identified last week by code, essentially. In this charging document, they're identified by letters. Some of those folks will be charged. Others are still under investigation. And so all I can tell you is that this is an ongoing investigation. You're seeing bits and pieces. And I'm not able to put a frame around the whole investigation for you, but as time goes on, there'll be additional information that comes forward.
According to the code that you just referenced in that affidavit, it appeared that Campos was not going to be arrested. Is there something that changed in this investigation, like with Mr. Sun, where you all decided that you had to make an arrest because there was an issue?
The reason why we unsealed, I should say the reason why this matter became public last week was because of evidence that one of the targets had been obstructing the investigation, essentially by spreading the word to potential targets that there was an undercover investigation. And so at that point we determined that we no longer had the confidentiality we would need in order to safely carry out an undercover investigation. So that's why the investigation became public last week. That's also part of the reason why this matter was unsealed this week.
Rod, you said yesterday in the hearing with Mr. Sun, the prosecutor said to the judge that Mr. Sun was under investigation for witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Is that who you were just talking about?
That's correct.
So you're identifying Mr. Sun as being the person who was tampering with the investigation?
We identified that in the course of the detention hearing. It was one of our justifications initially for seeking detention and then for seeking terms of release that we thought would protect our concerns about potential tampering with the case.
And following up, the nonprofits that allegedly took part in the kickbacks, were they really nonprofits?
I'm not going to comment on that. You know, there are particular organizations that are detailed in this document. There are others that may be within the scope of our investigation. I'm just not going to be able to identify any of those at this time. I think the charging documents reflect at one point that Mr. Campos suggests that you could just make up a nonprofit. As long as it's a nonprofit, he'd be able to arrange for funds to be directed to it from the county council. That's all I can say about that. Yes, sir.
The charging documents, the plea documents indicate direct quotations. Are we to assume there was a significant amount of confidential recording and wiretapping that occurred in this investigation, similar to the others?
Yes, there were. Yeah, you know, I can't assure you that every quote is preserved on audio tape, but yes, in the course of the undercover investigation, we did use covert recording devices to capture some of those conversations.
Are any of those recordings made available publicly now? Or?
No, to the extent, as I said, we're only permitted to disclose what's in the public record at this point, because by virtue of the plea agreement. Limited information about Mr. Campos is in the public record by virtue of the affidavits accompanying the complaints. You've got information there. You know, there's other information that will emerge as we progress. There will be additional charges. There will be other people who are prosecuted. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to tell you the details about those cases until the appropriate time. Yes, ma'am.
You know that Mr. Campos worked for Jack Johnson. Does this in any way tie back to that?
Yeah, as I said, the allegation is what it is. We didn't go all that far back in time. There are allegations, I should say, Mr. Campos admitted as part of his plea. He admitted to having received money as early as 2007. That's all I can speak to is what's in the charging document. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hey, Rod, did the U.S. Attorney's Office or any of these investigative agencies request or recommend Mr. Campos resign from the State House?
No, but let me tell you how this process works. When we get into a situation like this where we have evidence of criminal conduct by somebody in public office, that's a matter that we take extremely seriously. And so our prosecutors, during this undercover investigation, have consulted regularly with officials in Washington about how to deal with that type of situation. Ultimately, the decision whether or not to resign is left to the public official, him or herself. We do not dictate that as part of our investigation.
In the affidavit last week, it mentioned a former elected official, who I'm guessing is Mr. Campos. There was also a current elected official. Can you give us any update in terms of when?
Right. So let me clarify. You're guessing, and maybe an educated guess. As I tried to make clear, it's just not. It's not my function to knit together this case and that case. Although I acknowledge that there are overlaps. Yes, there are other elected officials who are within the scope of our ongoing investigation.
Current elected officials?
Yes.
Rod, the General Assembly is convening starting tomorrow. It's a 90-day session. What are people to think? I mean, there's already talk in Annapolis. Is there someone who could be coming in as a sitting lawmaker who is a target of an investigation? And how long will it go before it becomes known who that person might be?
As I mentioned, when we have investigations that involve elected public officials, our goal is to move as expeditiously as we can, but not prematurely, right? We don't bring cases unless we believe the evidence is sufficient to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, again with the caveat that it's always subject to the decision of the judge and jury. But we need to make certain that we've reached that point in our investigation before we bring charges. And we're actually not permitted to make any public disclosures before that point. And so I regret I can't give any more detail than that. As I said, there are plenty of honest politicians in Annapolis. They've got nothing to worry about, right? It's only folks who have been involved in corruption that should be concerned that we may come knocking on their doors.
Was it the IRS that flagged this case to your office, and how did you begin this investigation?
The IRS has provided significant support, and they're very helpful because of their expertise with financial matters, but the primary mover in this investigation has been the FBI.
Can you talk about, I believe it was mentioned in the press release, but how much money are we talking about here that he walked away with?
Well, as I said, I can only talk to you today about what's reflected in the plea agreement. And the plea agreement reflects a substantial amount of money. The majority, the largest amounts in the plea agreement actually predated our undercover investigation. There's, I believe, a total of $325,000 in county grants, in addition to tens of thousands of dollars in county charitable funds, which, as the chief mentioned, these are funds that are administered by the county council. In terms of what Mr. Campos admitted he put into his pocket, you can add it up for yourself. I think it's going to be somewhere in the order of 40 to 50,000 all told, but don't hold me to that. You can add it up yourself. There's the money that he was paid during our investigation, and then the money that he acknowledged that he had received prior to, or I should say unrelated to, because there was also some overlap, but money he received from other sources that he's acknowledged he received as a result of bribes.
I sort of didn't hear what you said at the end there. You said the primary mover was the FBI. I didn't hear.
Well, the question was, what was the role of the IRS? Did the IRS lead the investigation? The answer is the IRS provided critical support. This is primarily an FBI investigation with a lot of support from Prince George's County Police, as well as the IRS.
I'm going to take another stab at this. So the legislature starts tomorrow. What is the public to think? A document last week, in fact, implicated a sitting member. We've talked about essentially the purchase of the bill, or at least efforts to pass the bill in the prior session. And yet these guys are going into committee meetings and going to start casting votes. What should be happening here?
Well, let me preface this by saying that one thing that should be reassuring, and that is that people are actually investigating and prosecuting public corruption. If you heard nothing about corruption at all, you shouldn't necessarily conclude there's no corruption, your state is 100% clean. You might be concerned maybe nobody's paying attention. And so I think that's the reassuring aspect here, is you do have a unified commitment by federal and state and local law enforcement to root out corruption. And so we're going to find some. You're concerned, might there be another corrupt legislator? Yes, there might. Might there be one we don't know about? Yes, there might. Our mission is, we're not the police of the legislature. Our job is to pursue the evidence that we find to its logical conclusion. And if we determine that the folks that we're looking at merit federal prosecution, then we're going to return those charges when they're ready. And unfortunately, until we reach that point, we're just not in position to talk about it publicly.
You said that your hand was, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, your hand was forced in actions by Mr. Sun in removing that confidentiality, and while you're casting this net, can you say how many cases might have been left on the table because of his actions, where you have not been able to gather the reasonable doubt that you need to prove?
So I don't necessarily endorse your characterization of it, but I understand the point, and the answer is we just never know. Our goal in covert investigations is to keep them covert as long as we can, always weighing the impact. As we discussed earlier, we don't want to leave public officials in office beyond the point where we're confident that we have sufficient evidence to merit charges. And so it's a constant weighing of the cost versus the benefit of the investigation. Are we leaving anything on the table? I would say no, because any credible allegations of corruption that we have, we are going to continue pursuing. And so there will be, as I mentioned earlier, more than one legislator who remains under investigation. And there are also a number of private citizens who I anticipate are going to be charged before we're finished with this investigation.
Two questions. Can you elaborate a little bit on how Mr. Campos' arrest is tied into the liquor board investigation at all? And secondly, do you believe that he was involved in illegal activity after he became judge?
So the answer is that no, I'm not going to be able to elaborate on how it relates to the early investigation. I'm just acknowledging that it relates. In terms of what the factual interplay is, you can draw your own inferences from reading the documents, but I'm not able to talk about that. In terms of what Mr. Campos did after he was caught, I can't comment on that as well. I can tell you only that what we've charged in this, what's reflected in this plea agreement reflects criminal conduct that we believed we could prove beyond a reasonable doubt and for which we think he ought to be held accountable. I can't comment beyond that.
Rod,
yes, sir, in the front.
Chief, if you could, sir, if you could speak on ensuring Prince George's County residents that now corruption will be a top priority for you because of what's all this is taking place.
Well, again, I want to make it clear to my community, and this is a multi-jurisdictional effort between the U.S. Attorney's Office, between the FBI, the IRS, and the Prince George's County Police. But as I said before, the community can rest assured that I and the men and women of the Prince George's County Police Department will work diligently to ensure the integrity of our institutions and preserve the public trust. And in furtherance of that, the United States Attorney, Mr. Rosenstein, is absolutely correct. If there are individuals out there aware of this conduct, they can contact the Prince George's County Police, they can contact the FBI. Myself and the special agent in charge speak weekly. Myself and the assistant special agent speak weekly. We are fully engaged, and it was very complimentary, and I appreciate that. But we are every bit as invested in public corruption as we are in violent crime and fatal collisions in Prince George's County. And that speaks to the rapidly evolving community that Prince George's County is, and the rapidly evolving police department that the Prince George's County Police Department continues to be.
Rod, you mentioned repeatedly oversight and auditing. Do you happen to know what's become of these $100,000 charity slush funds, and what are your thoughts about what the county should do about those?
Part of our mission really is to expose fraud and opportunities for fraud, and it's up to the folks who administer those funds to make the determinations about how to respond to it. So I don't want to offer any concrete. Let me rephrase. I don't want to offer any specific suggestion. My general point is that when there is oversight, there are fewer opportunities for corruption and more likelihood, a greater likelihood that corruption will be exposed. And so I think when you have something like this developed, the logical thing to do is to look at what the procedure is for spending the funds and what the procedure is for auditing after the fact to see how the funds have been spent, and that will provide some assurance that it's being done properly.
3 o'clock in the nation's capital, and you're watching live coverage of a truly remarkable news conference that's going on in Greenbelt right now. And that is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland, Rod Rosenstein, who is announcing the arrest and plea agreement for a former member of Prince George's Council. Also before that, or also following that, he was a member of the Maryland General Assembly, William Alberto Campos Escobar. Will Campos is how he was best known. And just an amazing web of corruption. We're listening in on the questions and answers, and we'll continue with that, and then we'll wrap things up when they're done.
The county executive, other officials have done a lot to try to sell the county, so to speak, to folks as a place to be, place to raise your family and all of that. What does this do to the image, and can anything be done to sort of clean things up?
Well, I think Mr. Rosenstein said it very well when he said that you cannot be assured that this isn't occurring in your community because you don't know about it. And I think my presence here, and I owe a great debt of gratitude to the United States Attorney for the role that the Prince George's County the police department has played in this, because it speaks to the fact that they are confident of the integrity of my agency and the administration that I report to. And so my message to the community is, instead of assuming that everything's fine because you don't see it, know that we are actively looking for it, and my standing here speaking to it should provide reassurance that where we find this behavior, we will act, and we will act in concert with these agencies to, again, ensure the public trust.
Any final questions?
Just to clarify something, last week's affidavit mentioned a former elected official and a current elected official. A few minutes ago, you said there are more than one elected official or officials currently under investigation. So just to clarify.
Yes. Yes, that is an accurate statement.
Okay.
Prince George's County or Maryland?
I'm not going to be any more specific than that.
Can the FBI say how this was brought to their attention, this particular case with Mr. Cummings?
Probably not, but I'll let Mr. Johnson answer that.
No, I'm going to defer to the U.S. Attorney for that.
That's a good try. Any final questions? Yes, sir.
Yesterday, your U.S. Attorney said that there were 30 months worth of wiretaps, and indicating that Mr. Sun had been under wiretap surveillance for about 2.5 years. If he had not tipped off these people, was it because you were reeling in all these fish through these wiretaps, and your investigation was continuing to grow through these wiretaps as you were hearing about different people that may have been involved? So theoretically, your investigation could be continuing, and we wouldn't even know anything about it.
That's exactly correct. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Over the last 25 minutes, a remarkable news conference. Rod Rosenstein, who is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland, we heard from the Special Agent in charge of the FBI, the Baltimore Field Office, Special Agent in charge of the IRS investigatory arm. What we come away with is two things. One, a former Maryland delegate and a Prince George's councilman, William Alberto Campos Escobar, better known as Will Campos, 42 of Hyattsville, pleaded guilty to federal charges of taking bribes related to the performance of his official duties. The guilty plea was entered under seal on the 5th. It was unsealed yesterday and made public. What we have learned is that while he was a member of Prince George's Council, Campos apparently offered bribes, received bribes, got kickbacks. He used a fund that's given to all members of county council. It's discretionary money. You can spend it however you wish, and apparently there is not any oversight worth mentioning of what you're doing with it. Well, what Campos did, according to the U.S. Attorney, is bribed a number of officials. And what we've also learned from this news conference is we heard originally when the liquor board was raided last week that there was one former and one current member of the General Assembly also under investigation. Well, today we learned that it's members, plural, of the General Assembly, which convenes tomorrow in Annapolis. So you have the prospect of members of the General Assembly duly elected, but also under the microscope of the FBI and the IRS in a spreading bribery scandal. And there was a lot of questioning about when we might know more. And U.S. Attorney Rosenstein would only say that the investigation continues and that expect action would come later on. So we have the prospect here of a continuing and spreading scandal that involves tens of thousands of dollars, 4 years worth of investigatory work that has gone on now. And apparently all this has come to a head because one of the original people who was indicted on the former member and at one point executive director of that county liquor board, who had been wearing a FBI wire for a long time, apparently then started tipping off the people who were in this investigation that they were in fact under investigation, and so the FBI has had to move very fast. This is a remarkable story. We're learning more about it almost by the hour. Keep it here. We'll keep you up to the minute.